In John chapter 16, we see that Jesus is promising the gift of the coming Holy Spirit, who will not only be with them, he'll also be indwelling them and empowering them. And this empowering presence is one of the critical dynamics of the spiritual life. It's the key to Romans chapter 8, overcoming the dilemma of Romans 7. The Romans 7 dilemma being that we find ourselves in a kind of warfare internally, almost raging against ourselves, but it's not the deepest self that's at fault, it's the outward level. And it's the power of the Spirit who makes it possible for us to manifest His fruit and to actually realize and to display this new identity we've been given in Christ according to Romans 6. So Romans 6 tells us who we are. Romans 7 describes the struggle that a believer will face with the problem of living in ways that are incompatible with our new identity. And Romans 8 gives the solution to that dilemma. Namely, God gave us a provision of power. So He not only tells us how we ought to live, but He also gives us the power to do it. So it's not a matter of just instructions or something of that sort, but He gives us the empowering presence of the Spirit. And moreover, the Spirit's ministry and roles, as we saw last week, are just rich and varied insofar as He baptizes us, He seals us, He anoints us, He encourages us, He comforts us, He convicts us, He inspires us. He illuminates our thoughts and our minds as we study the Scriptures, and many other ministries as well. So that the Holy Spirit's ministry that He's giving to the disciples and describing to them is in part designed to address the tremendous emotional concern that they are now encountering with the awful realization that Jesus is going to depart and go to a place that they cannot follow. And this is a dreadful thought for them. Now you recall they were selective in their hearing and only heard the parts that they wanted to hear, namely about His reigning and His righteous reign over the world and His coming kingdom, where He judged the 12 tribes of Israel and so forth, and through that be the king who will come, the messianic ruler. But at the same time, when He would speak to them about the other aspects of prophecy, namely the suffering servant, this part they didn't want to hear. They were not interested, nor were the people of His time interested in the Messiah as a suffering servant, but only as a reigning king. And so now it becomes so obvious to them that they can no longer selectively exclude what He's been teaching them with greater frequency and clarity about the fact that He'll be taken and that He will be beaten and that He'll be spit upon, that He will be scourged, He'll be crucified, and that He would rise from the dead. So now they realize He's going to a place that they cannot follow. So He's giving them a word about this, and He's talking about joy. And one of the things that I find that's fascinating about John 16 to 33, is this notion of joy. It's a recurring theme. We certainly also saw it in chapter 14, but we see it again here. And it speaks about a kind of a joy that transcends what the world can offer. And particularly in 20 to 22, he speaks about your grief will be turned into joy. And in verse 21, the joy that a child has been born into the world. You have grief, but no one will take your joy away from you. And this brings us to a very important principle to grasp. A principle in the spiritual life I want you to hear well, because it relates to every one of us in this room. It's a profound principle, and I want us to listen to his words in verse 16 and to 22. So let's just listen to his teaching first, and I want to pull a principle that I believe you can apply this very day. He says, "A little while, and you'll no longer see me. And again a little while, and you will see me." And this, of course, really sets them at loggerheads. They can't figure out what he's talking about. Some of his disciples then said to one another, "What is this thing he is telling us, a little while and you will not see me, and again a little while and you will see me?" and because I go to the Father. So they were saying, what is this that he says, a little while? We do not know what he's talking about. They're totally discombobulated, confused, but they're almost afraid to ask him directly. They're talking among one another. So Jesus knew that they wished to question him, and he said to them, are you deliberating together about this, that I said a little while and you will not see me, and again a little while and you will see me? Truly, truly, I say to you that you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will grieve, but your grief will be turned into joy. And then here's this principle that I'm going to unpack this morning. Whenever a woman is in labor, she has pain because her hour has come. But when she gives birth to the child, she no longer remembers the anguish because of the joy that a child has been born into the world. Therefore, you too have grief now, but I will see you again, and your heart will rejoice, and no one will take your joy away from you. Now, we've seen that he's been talking more than once about these three first fruits of the Spirit, namely love, joy, peace. An astonishing thought in his parting words to his disciples now that he has been betrayed, Judas has gone out, and that awful word, it says, and Judas went out, and it was night. And that chilling word that John adds, even though we knew it was night, John adds that word because of his thematic portrait of light versus darkness, day versus night, the children of light versus the children of darkness. And it's a motif. And it's this idea that the powers of darkness, and Satan actually filled Judas at that time. And he said, what you do quickly. It's an awful time, and you have all these forces converging. And it's also the climax, because Jesus, knowing that his hour had finally come, that he should depart from the world, in which he would glorify the Father, all these things are meshing and merging together in a way that is astonishing to the disciples, perplexing, confusing to them. So he gives them these words of love, of joy, of peace. I'm going to offer you a peace that the world cannot comprehend. I'm offering you a joy that transcends circumstances, not mere happiness, but a joy which is a choice. I'm offering you a love which is a choice. And all these three, I want you to know, are choices, not just emotions. Love, joy, and peace are choices that we can make. And in fact, it would be a lie to suppose that people can determine your level of happiness. They don't control that if you don't let that. There is in Scripture the reality that we are not controlled by other people's opinions, but we can believe lies and suppose that's the case. Actually, if we are defined by the truths of the Word, then we transcend the circumstances that we encounter, and we can be a people who rejoice always, who pray without ceasing, and in everything give thanks, for this is God's will for us in Christ Jesus. It's impossible of attainment unless the Spirit of God empowers us to do those things. But therein lies the truth, that the spiritual life is not difficult. What is it? Impossible. You're catching on. You're catching on. Only one person can live the Christian life, and that's Jesus. But he can do that in you and through you as you. And therein lies the genius of this whole thing. It's not merely you trying to do something for God, how am I doing? But rather, you're inviting him to live through you. And that allegory of the vine and the branches that we saw in the last chapter, in chapter 15, is totally apropos to this, because apart from me, he said, you can do nothing. So that he said, if you derive your vitality from me as branches in this vine, then you will find that my life will flow in you and through you, and actually you'll be bearers of fruit, because the fruit that you bear, which you don't need, actually is excess life, which will feed and nourish and nurture others, and it'll reproduce because it has its own seeds of reproduction. So it's a genius, it's a brilliant dynamic of the spiritual life that's highly Trinitarian. Trinitarian because he again and again layers the role of the Father and of the Spirit as well as his role in their lives. A very rich and powerful portrait indeed. Now, what we want to see in this principle that he's using, this metaphor of birth, is this. God brings joy to our lives, but not by substitution, but by transformation. That's what I want to unpack. He does not bring joy by bringing a substitution of one problem and replacing it with another, but rather, he brings joy by transformation. His illustration of the woman giving birth makes this clear. The same baby that caused the pain is the same one who causes the joy. It's an interesting thought, this whole motif. Bear in mind as well that the pain in childbirth is part of the curse, was it not? In pain, you will have children. It was not as it was meant to be, but he uses this actual analogy of the curse to transmute that into a greater good. So what we have here is that instead of relieving the mother's pain, God transforms it. The mother's sorrow is replaced by joy. It's not replaced by joy, rather, but it's transformed into joy. You catch the difference? It's not replaced by something, but the very thing itself is transformed into another. Let's look at it in another light. Suppose the parents continue to take a child, and anytime a toy breaks, they basically substitute a broken toy with another toy. So what will happen is the child will grow up expecting every problem to be solved by substitution. This is broken, you replace it. That's how it works. That's the mindset we can easily pick up. But the way of substitution for solving problems is the way of immaturity. There's a much more profound movement than just substituting. The way of transformation is the way of faith and maturity. We cannot mature emotionally or spiritually if someone's always replacing our broken toys. You see the concept? Instead, God has a brilliant system that he shows and illustrates actually through the reality of something every one of us in this room has gone through. When you were in womb world and during your birth, that caused agony to the mother. And that agonizing, manifestation, a symbol and a sign of a fallen world, is something that is then transmuted by a joy that lasts. And this is the concept that we want to see, that the pain was very brief, but the joy endures. And this is a critical notion here. Our concept of time changes with our feelings. So there are some times when you are in a situation where you're miserable and time just seems to drag, doesn't it? We know what that's like. There are other times when it just seems to whiz by in those great moments. I don't know, our perception of time is pretty fluid that way. Reminds me of a Gary Larson cartoon. I almost gave it to you, Pat, but didn't. I could have put it maybe I'll do it next time. Give you a little thumb drive. But it's the parenting advantages of dentists. Is the title? That's the caption. He calls it the parenting advantages of dentists. Now, bear in mind, he was raised in the 50s, and at that time, dentistry was not painless. It is now. Dentistry has completely changed. Dentists get a bad rap now. But I remember the horrors of Dr. Mazzara's chair. I remember the guy, and it was a horror. And these drills were huge and very slow, and it was an agonizing situation. What they did, it was like a form of cruelty. I think you needed to take a course in sadism in order to be involved in this thing. So what he has here is this kid, and this kid who's Gary Larson, because he's always the doofus in the yellow and white striped shirt, with the pimples and with the glasses. That's him in the 50s. And you can see the kid's just knocked over a vase, and so the father is sitting in the living room, and he says, "That's it, young man." He says, "Go down to the basement and sit in a chair." He says, "I'll be down shortly. Looks like it's time for one of our appointments. And what you see in the bottom of below is the image of the dentist chair there. And he's got, in the darkness there, you see that awful chair and all the accoutrements there. It's like the guy was just like me. He went through the same problem. I may have had the same dentist, I don't know. But so that's why he calls it the parenting advantage of dentists, because you see one of our appointments. He won't forget. But the point is this: we know we've been in situations where we are anticipating something painful, and it's just the time just seems to go by very slowly. But then there are other times of joy, and we're having a great time, and it just whizzes by. But your perception is interesting along this line. The mother feels as though the birth is taking a long time, and indeed, sometimes it can be many hours. And that is indeed not to be minimized. It's an agonizing process for many. But here's the thing. It really is only a little while. And this is what he says, it's only a little while. Because what happens when the baby is born, the pain is forgotten and joy fills her heart for the fact that the child is brought into the world. You see this idea? So if you look at the line of pain in terms of the birth, relative to the time of enjoying that child, well, you can see the obvious point. The joy, the pain is brief, ephemeral, but it's transmuted into a greater good, a greater thing that never would have occurred otherwise. And I think you can look at your own life in this world in the same manner. Suppose a man lives 80 years and it's not an easy life for him. He goes through a lot of agony or difficulties or pains and problems. He seeks to follow Jesus, has opposition and problems. They may be physical, they may be relational, they may be vocational, they may be financial. Maybe a combination of those things. Nobody's immune to pain. No one's immune to disappointment and pain and adversity. But God's business is the business of transmuting that pain into something far better. He's not going to just substitute it. He's going to transmute it into a greater good, into joy. And that joy will endure. Another way of looking at it is this: if you draw a timeline for the next 1,000 years, what percentage of time was that 80? And you can see now 10,000, now 100,000, and you get the point. That time will seem as if it were nothing. And 1,000 years, 10,000 years in His presence, and your earthly span will seem like a vague, distant memory in comparison with the joy that will endure. And it's a perspective, it's a point of view. And it is this perspective that empowers us to be overcomers in the midst of current adversity. We don't downplay the nature of adversity. I'm merely saying, though, perspective, a biblical top-down perspective, can inform and infuse an understanding that actually life is more than this. This is actually a means to a greater good, and God will transmute the pain into joy. He's in the business of redeeming adversity. And only in the biblical account of life do I see a God who actually takes pain and uses it for a greater good. That He makes it the stuff of redemption and the stuff of spiritual growth. And how many times have we described the qualities of men and women that we most admire as having characteristics and qualities such as courage, patience, integrity, and a wide array of virtues that we truly admire in heroes. But you know that those qualities that we admire are never forged in times of adversity, of ease, but always in adversity. If everything goes your way and things are running smoothly, chances are you will not develop much character at all. So that the pain itself can actually forge, as a crucible will actually heat up the metal, and then the dross rises to the surface, and the gold or silversmith just skims that dross off, and every time it's purified somewhat more, the heat rises and so forth, more is skimmed off, and it's a process that we're not home yet. We're really pilgrims, sojourners, strangers, and aliens. And so in this journey, then, we know we're not home. We know we're heading home, but right now, He is really causing us to be prepared for our eternal citizenship. And He'll do whatever it takes, Because the phrase I've given you 100 times is that God is much more concerned about your character than he is about your comfort. And that he's much more concerned about your holiness than he is about your apparent happiness. And that God's severe mercy will sometimes do and allow things in our lives that may at the time make no sense whatsoever. And he'll take things away. And things will get broken, and it will make no sense. But then, and there are times, however, in this life, we can look back and begin to see why that might have happened. But there will be many such things that you will not see this side of eternity. And you have to walk by faith and not by sight. But you know you will be satisfied when you see Jesus face to face. And that in that day, he says, you will ask me no question. You will have answers. You'll have a perspective. Thoughts on this principle, Archie?
So this idea of joy, you think that sometimes, so you don't get full clarity on the situation or the circumstance, and I've found that sometimes I don't even find the joy. And that joy, for some situations, is that day when I see Jesus face to face, Revelation 4, when there will be no more sorrow, no more tears, no more suffering. So there's an anticipated joy.
Yes.
Well,
there's an anticipated joy, but there's another aspect in which that fullness of joy can be actually manifested by choosing to see that God's purpose is always redemptive and purposefully drawing you closer to conformity to the image of his Son. And when we see it that way, then there can be, even now, a joy, though you won't have the fullness of the joy until we see him face to face. But we can have still rejoice always, and that mindset. And it is the love, joy, peace, patience, the fruit of the Spirit that becomes possible. I think there was yes, Joe.
You mentioned that God has no timeline. I mean, he goes from eternity to eternity. And yet, you talk about that when we die, we'll think back 1,000 years, and it's only a little soundbite. My question to you is, do you believe that when we get to heaven, we go in God's eternity,
right,
and time means absolutely.
Yeah, it's a good question, Joe. He's asking, I don't know if you all heard it, but he's asking, will our experience of time become like that of God's, where we're kind of taken out of it? And my answer to that is no. We are embodied creatures who, in fact, are bound by space and time. Having said that, I believe our experience of time will be dramatically different. What that'll be like will be different. But I think that you cannot get away from the experiential apprehension of a succession of events that we encounter. And I cannot even begin to conceive of a God who transcends the boundaries of time, because bear in mind, time is an artifact of the creation. It did not exist. Matter, energy, space, time did not exist prior to the beginning. And he calls those things into being and chooses to participate in them and yet still transcend them. Remember this great statement in 2 Peter chapter 3. With the Lord, a day is as a what? 1,000 years. And what's the other half? 1,000 years is a day. Now this is a profound truth. You know where I go with this. I say, just by way of review, I'm saying what I'm doing. I'm really giving you the benefit of the doubt here is what I'm really doing. I'm complimenting you. You know where I'm going with this. You haven't a clue. No, you do. You do. The fact is that if you can just tease that out, he's not literally saying a day equals 1,000 years, but rather it's an analogy, and so you could just as well say a millisecond is like 1,000,000,000 years with God. Or you could just as well say a picosecond is like a sextillion years, and so we could go. The ultimate, an infinitesimal moment is for him eternity. This means, by the way, he has plenty of, quote, time to hear all of our prayers, even if it's 1,000,000 people praying at once, because he has forever in that moment. That's an interesting point. He has plenty of time. However, the other side of the coin is equally true. And 1,000 years is what? like a day. So you could just go the other way and tease that out until you now have that an infinite amount of time to God is like an infinitesimal moment. Thus he sees the eternal now and sees all things in one present glance. So that's the other side of the coin. So that with him, he sees all things, and everything for him is present. And it's a thing I can't get my hands around. I can't get my arms around that. Whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to his image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And these whom he called, he also justified. These whom he justified, he also glorified. It sounds like he's involved in linearity, but that's a logical sequence because he sees it as one present moment. It's not like he was back there figuring out what's going to happen there. He's in all times. I'll leave that with you. I can't grasp what I'm talking about. Yes.
Is that why then, when we get in a crisis or something happens, you hear people say, it seemed like eternity.
Yeah.
In other words, like in 1 second.
Yeah.
It seemed like it went on forever.
Yeah. I think when I speak about the different experience of time, here's a suspicion. I can't prove this. My suspicion is that time right now we construe as like a torrential river that carries its sons away. Remember that? What's that from? What hymn's that from?
Oh God, our health and age.
They're very good. David, I knew you'd get that one. And it's not fair. And I believe that's an Isaac Watts hymn. And Isaac Watts is meditating on Psalm 90 to arrive at that very notion. And he talks about because that psalm is Moses' meditation on the brevity of earthly life in comparison with the eternality of the living God, among other things. Teach us to number our days. Right now, time is almost construed as an enemy. There's just not enough time to do all that we would know that we could do. We know this. My favorite line from A.W. Tozer, I've quoted many times as well, but it's worth repeating. It's good stuff. He says, the days of the years of our lives are few and swifter than a weaver's shuttle. And a weaver's shuttle, wham, wham. You take the shuttle and you shoot it across, push down the loom, shoot it back across, push down the loom. Every day is like that. It's like in fast forward. And so he says, and he picks it up from Job, that imagery, but swifter than a weaver's shuttle. Life is a short and fevered rehearsal for a concert we cannot stay to give. Just when we have attained proficiency, we're forced to lay our instruments down. There's just not enough time, not enough opportunity to do all that we know that the constitution of our natures tells us we're capable of doing. And at first that would sound depressing, but then when we realize, though, yes, that's true of our earthbound existence, but bear in mind, when civilizations are gone and all these things are changed and the new heavens and the new earth comes, you will still be there. And then you will have all the time. My suspicion then is that instead of a torrential river taking our vitality away, time will then be perhaps construed as a pool in which we swim and luxuriate. You'll never have a lack of time then. It'll be your agency, your friend, and you'll have all the time you need to do all that your capacities reveal that you are capable of doing. You'll have plenty of time. Lots of things you won't be able to do on this planet, and you come to realize that. The midlife crisis, usually appraised or discerned between the ages of 38 and 45. That's when most people go through their midlife crisis. Some people can defer it for a while. Some people get a little bit earlier, but eventually we all realize that we're mortal. And when we come to realize I'm not going to be able to do all that I thought I could do, I'm not going to be able to accomplish these things. I don't have enough time. That then can be tragic, or it can cause us to realize we're not home yet. There are things you won't be able to do now that you would love to do, but you will have all the time. So to me, time would be an agency that would be it would be an ally now, not an enemy. That's my guess, my speculation on that. Any other thoughts? Yes.
I had a priest tell me one time, Ken, that if God exposed himself to us, then we would not have free will.
Precisely so. If he manifested himself in his fullness, remember that parable of Kierkegaard I gave you a couple of weeks ago? Didn't I give you one about the maiden that the king fell in love with?
Yeah.
Remember that? James, you remember this. Does anyone else remember it? Or you were the only guy here? Very, very briefly, just again, the nutshell version of it, Kierkegaard imagines that there's a king who sees a humble maiden and falls in love with her at first sight. But he knows that if he comes to her and reveals himself in his glory and his power with his retinue of servants, his army, and his regalia, that she would surely accept the offer of marriage, but would she love him? How could he know? So he chooses then to come to her in anonymity, in disguise. He comes in the form of a humble woodsman, but basically seeks to woo her, to draw her to himself, to call her. And by the way, courtship and wooing is the closest thing I know to dealing with the mystery of sovereignty on the one hand and human responsibility on the other, where we can actually affect another's choice. But the point is this, that he woos her in anonymity. And then, having fallen in love with him, he's now in a position where he can reveal himself fully. That is the stuff of which heaven will be like, Rusty. I think when we see Jesus, then you will see that face, that when you see him, you'll realize that's what you were looking for in every other thing. Many in false goods, but you realize that's what you were looking for. And then you wouldn't even be able to think of the alternative. But then what will happen is you'll see by sight what you trusted by faith. And so the affirmation of what we embraced by faith in the Shadowlands, which was not forced upon us, but wooed instead, the sacred romancer, Paul pulls us to himself, and then we have the consummation of that intention, of that desire, and seeing him in his fullness, then you could never think otherwise. That's my suspicion anyway. God will not force us. He will not overwhelm us. He will not invade us. He will not violate us, but he will draw us. And those who wish to know him and who seek will find. Those who seek to avoid him will successfully avoid him. Yes?
Am I wrong, but it seems like our joy comes in two parts. One is in our hope and knowledge and confirmation that we will have that eternity with him to fulfill our purpose. But on a day-to-day basis, it comes from knowing that we are fulfilling his purpose.
Yes.
And that anticipation, that joy is almost like a child anticipating Christmas.
That's right.
And there's so many of us in the day-to-day problems mixed up joy with happiness.
Yes, the mixture of joy and happiness is a mistake, because it wasn't who for the happiness set before him endured the cross, Hebrews 12, but rather the joy set before him, he endured the cross. A fierce, intentional joy, fierce in the face of opposition, but it sustains a joy and a peace that transcends all comprehension. But even now, though, our joy on this planet is only marginal in comparison with its full appropriation in the heavenly realm.
But I think we can be joyful if we are content in fulfilling his purpose in life.
I see that as well. And really, at the end of the day, your intentions define you. I want you to see that again. We've mentioned this before, but I want you to grasp this truth. You are shaped by that to which you aspire. You become conformed by your intention, your aspiration. And that is why Henry Scougal in 1633 put it this way in the Life of God and the Soul of Man. He said, the worth and excellency of a soul is to be determined by the object of its love. And if you love the highest thing, then your intention will be such that you will not be satisfied with lesser goods, and you will be shaped and conformed by your aspirations and your desires.
I heard that intentions are much better than goals.
I would say so. Dallas Willard has a model that he calls VIM, V-I-M. We've talked about this too. We talked about everything. But we have to remind ourselves. Vision, intention, means, V-I-M. What's your vision of a flourishing and fruitful life? Secondly, what's the price tag? Am I willing to pay it? That's intention. So what do you want? What do you seek? John 1:38 is first question. That's a fundamental question. And then intention, are you willing to, here's the price, are you willing to pay it? And then if you can answer yes to that, the third, means, follows. Then here's the way in which you do it. Yes?
Is there a distinction between the temporal human emotion of happiness and the spiritual fruit of joy? Or is it the object?
Is it the second,
The object.
the object?
The object of joy, pride,
Yeah,
or the object, a good meal or a bottle.
yeah.
Both can bring happiness.
Yes. Yeah, the things themselves can bring happiness and pleasure and the pleasures of this world. There's nothing wrong with those pleasures, but they're generally circumstantially based. That is to say, they depend on circumstances, whereas joy transcends circumstances. That's sort of how I see it. Joy goes beyond whether things are good or bad. Joy is a choice to embrace God's purposes that are redemptive and worthwhile and that are going to conform us into His image, even if it's a severe mercy that's being allowed. Yes?
Here's my view on joy. It's I look back recently, in recent years, of the most intense time in my life when I could not get out of a situation, and all I could do is cry out to Jesus. I would never go back to that morning. But when I look back now and I see that, you know what? I had joy in those times, and it had to come from Him.
Yeah. There'll be times when everything seems to have been pulled away, all the props have been kicked out. And those are the times when you've only got Him, that's all you've got. Again, and He's the one who's carrying you at that time. The old footsteps again in the beach, and you wonder why there's only one set of footsteps during the worst time, rather than two sets, and because He's carrying you at that time is the metaphor that's being used in that story. The idea He lifts you up and does that, and He'll allow us. And those are painful moments, but you wouldn't trade them because of the gain that you received from the process. Yeah, yes.
I think I missed something there. If intention is what shapes us,
Yes.
at what point does our action then substantiate what our intentions are? 'Cause the only way you can tell what my intentions are is by what I do eventually.
That's correct. So that, again, going to vision, intention, and means. If your intentions are, in fact, that I'm going to pay the price, then they will be manifested in action, and that's where the means become manifest. What agency do I use to bring this thing to bear? So that's where the means component comes in. But if there are no actions, then the intentions were only preliminary and theoretical. So that the intent, the means and the actions substantiate the reality of the intention. It's easy to play to speak a good game, isn't it? There are a lot of people who can go to conferences or go to church and they sound, very spiritual. Oh no, you take this parking spot. Oh no, you. And so it's really easy to be cheap and feel really good about one another. But then on Monday, it's a different story about that parking lot and about a lot of other things as well. There are some situations where you can appear to do it. The reality, I think, Bill, is action and obedience. This is why if you love me, you'll keep my commandments.
Reflects it, right?
What's that?
It reflects the truth.
It reflects the truth.
Aren't all these Herculean tasks designed to point out our weaknesses, so we'll surrender to them?
I think in part they reveal things to ourselves that would otherwise not be seen, because there are times when we can get a little bit arrogant, a little cocky, and we think we're the king of the universe, and then God in His grace has to humble us under His mighty hand to bring us back to a little dose of reality, that apart from me, you forgot, you think you can do something. Can't do anything. But these are great questions, and I've allowed us to do this a little bit more than usual, but back to our text. You forgot this was a study of John. This is why this is the 67th part in this series, and we're still not with John 16. We got to finish this guy. We really don't have to. What's the agenda? But there you have it. And so he says in that day, so this is a wonderful perspective. In that day, you will not question me about anything. It's an interesting statement that could be teased out. But I think we're going to have answers to questions that we hardly can even frame right now. But we will be satisfied, it's my conviction. And no one will say, but I thought you said, you promised. No one's going to raise the clenched hand when we see him and see his powerful and profound justice and grace. You'll question me nothing. Truly, I say to you, if you ask the Father for anything in my name, he will give it to you. Now, he's saying, I'm going away, but I'm not leaving you as orphans, as he said earlier. But I'm actually giving you the resources that you need. And the resources are such that you will actually have the Father who will be present with you to meet your needs, as well as the Holy Spirit. So he says, until now you've asked for nothing in my name, ask and you will receive, that your joy, once again that phrase, joy may be made full in this life. And so you can ask and receive. And in my view, the promise of the privilege of prayer is huge and emphasized in the Upper Room Discourse. It's emphasized in chapter 14, verses 12 to 14, and 15:7, and now 16, 23 to 26. Believing prayer is a secret to the spiritual life. And the idea of prayer in part is to bring your needs, your concerns, your fears, your hopes, your desires, and actually turn it into a dialogue with God. You're struggling with a business decision. It'd be insanity for you not to bring that before God and wrestle with him and seek his wisdom. And the combination of both divine agency of radical dependence on the one hand and human responsibility and discipline on the other hand is meshed together into a synergistic union whereby it's a divine human process, but you've got to welcome him in. A businessman who's a follower of Jesus is a fool if he makes decisions without making it a matter of prayer. He's cutting himself off from his greatest power when he does that. And God can open up some doors and he'll close other doors. And every one of us here who understands something about this, if you've been involved in various forms of business, often you'll know that some of your best deals, you happen to be at the right place at the right time. And some of the deals you worked hardest on fall apart. So to tell you something, it's not just a question of how hard you work. There are other factors involved. God, if he wishes, can take you down in a moment. I don't care how, you can triple your time. You think you can double up your hours at the office and make up for deficiency? He can take you down in a day, no matter how hard you work. But also, God can lift you up in a day. The example of Joseph is evident. He's the one, Deuteronomy 8, who gives you the power to make wealth. You suppose that my might and the strength of my hand brought me this wealth. No, it was God who gave you that power and that ability, and he can take it away and he can give it to you. So the realization then is to see that all things then are in his hands, and my call is to, when I have setbacks or when I have advances, regardless of them, to make my joy dependent on my relationship with the Father, in the Son, and in the power of the Spirit. And if that's there, then the other things I can see them in a proper way. I can hold God's gifts and graces with a loose enough grip so I don't have to hold on them so tightly that they define me. Because then you're not holding on to them, they're holding on to you. There's this grip that it has, and it can define you. Then you become defined by the abundance of your possessions. But Jesus said the abundance of life is not in your portfolio, but in your relationship with me. And that's where the abundant life comes from. So it's a redefinition of our value system. And at any rate, he's saying, pray. Involve him in your choices. Just as a loving father is concerned when a child is disturbed, even though it might seem to be a trivial matter, we are concerned, are we not? Because we love the child. And so we effectively kind of reduce ourselves to that apparent triviality and show that one kid is fighting with the other, and they're bothered and they're hurt. But it bothers you because you are a loving father, not because it's a huge issue, a momentous thing in life, but because you care. And a personal God cares, and therein lies the issue. He's a personal agency who cares for us in all our ways. And so that's why he says, if you have a concern, offer it to the Father. And then he says in verse 25, these things I've spoken to you in figurative language. In other words, you weren't quite ready to get the full import and understanding. But now in this 11th hour, in fact, my last night with you, the time is now such that the Father's purpose is there, and you will now grasp what I've been teaching you all along. He says, an hour is coming when I will no longer speak to you in figurative language, but will tell you plainly of the Father. In that day you will ask in my name. I don't say that I will request to the Father on your behalf, but the Father himself loves you. Because you've loved me and have believed that I came forth from the Father. And here's where he makes this clear, non-figurative statement, verse 28. Here's where his fullness of apprehension and disclosure, and it's a breakthrough moment. I came forth from the Father and have come into the world. I am leaving the world again and going to the Father. And his disciples had a moment of epiphany when they said, lo, now you're speaking plainly and are not using a figure of speech. Now we know that you know all things and have no need for anyone to question you. By this we believe that you came forth from God. That's a powerful statement. And he says, do you now believe? A little late. Last hour, you see? But they just caught on. And now he's about to leave. But bear in mind, the Father's timing is always perfect. And Jesus always does things according to the Father's time scale. And that's why we have to trust him enough to trust his timing. That's a huge issue there. If we trust him, we're going to have to trust his timing. And to be frank with you, these people seemed to be abysmally dense. They just weren't catching on spiritually at all. It's astonishing how slow they were to grasp. The Pharisees had a clearer picture of what was going on. And the women as well. These people were just a little bit on the spiritual buffoonery almost. But at the same time, they grasped now what's necessary. Do you now believe? And so he is saying now, in this world, in this word then, that this hour is coming and that you're going to be scattered. But I'm giving you this summary. He says, you're going to be scattered each to his own home. You're going to leave me alone, but I'm not alone because the Father is with me. They will, even though they have this powerful affirmation of faith, assurance, and understanding in verse 30, yet Jesus says, you're still going to fail me. Nevertheless, I'm going to use you powerfully. And therein lies the issue. Every man in this room has slipped, has fallen, has had setbacks. But God can take you and use you. As long as you have vitality in life, he can take you, in spite of our failures and blunders, he can pick us up and use us again. And that is a comforting word, that our past does not define us. It is our future that defines us. And our future reaches back into our bounded past.